Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy, Sports and Fitness Rants? I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back, man. Got another great video for you guys today, as usual, man. You guys know the deal on this channel. It's all about setting the record straight, stopping the lies, stopping the narratives, stopping them from rewriting the history. And in this video, man, it's going to be a subscriber-requested video. Shout out to my man, Somos Banditos. Hope I'm saying it right. Somos Banditos sent me an email the other day. I just saw it this morning. And he asked me to do a video on the great 90s players versus the great 2000s players. And he asked about, the comparisons and, which era do I think had the greater players, from, let's say a 1 through 10, so to speak. And I've told you guys in this channel, to me, that the 2000s is probably the last great decade or the last great era of the NBA. Because from about, 2012, I want to say, to about now, the NBA has kind of gone downhill since. If you want to say from, like I said, that 2012, 2014 range, somewhere in there, up until where we are now, the NBA had been going downhill for several years. We're talking about bad, guys. So for a lot of us, the 2000s era was really the last great era that you could really talk about these guys giving the effort, these guys playing defense, these guys showing up to work, not flopping as much, not load managing like they do now. They didn't have an in-season tournament or playing. We're going to talk about in this video, guys. But in this video, I'm going to break down the top perimeter defenders of the 2000s and the top perimeter defenders of the 90s. And we're just going to go through some of these guys and just mention some of these guys, talk about these guys, because some of these guys are forgotten from the 2000s and even from the 90s. And we're going to talk about these guys in this video, man. So shout out to Somos Banditos. And I want to thank you guys, everyone across the world, everyone across the states has been supporting my channel. Once again, guys, I am truly humbled by all the support, man. It means a lot. And you guys know what to do. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So, yes, guys, like I said, shout out to my man, Somos Banditos. He's been a supporter of my channel, man. Much respect to you. Thank you for your continued support. He asked me to do a video in the 90s versus the 2000s and the top players of the 2000s and the top player versus the top players of the 90s. And I've told you guys on this channel, I do not say or make a claim that the 90s or the 80s was a greater era than this era or that era. I've told you guys, we're here to put respect on the 80s and the 90s because they're always tearing down the 80s and the 90s. Always. And we know why they're doing that. They must continue to attack Michael Jordan's contemporaries, the people he played against. They must attack his legacy. But at the same time, they pump up Scottie Pippen. I told you, it doesn't make any sense, guys. They're complete hypocrites. Makes no sense at all. Everyone was bad except for Scottie Pippen. But I've told you guys also, to me, the 2000s is probably the last great era for the NBA. And I respected a lot of the great players of the 2000s. Excuse me, guys. Get some water here real quick here. So when I saw the email and he asked me about the comparisons of the top 90s players, versus the top 2000s players, I didn't really want to do a straight up comparison as far as trying to make a claim as one era being greater than the other. But I think we can all agree that the 90s, right, to me, the mid to late 80s, right, into the 90s is the golden era of basketball, guys. The golden era of basketball, when you think about the players that crossed over from those, like I said, those mid 80s into the 90s, and the popularity of the game in the 90s, it's the golden era of NBA. The 90s was the most popular era in NBA's history. And obviously, Michael Jordan had a lot to do with it, but it wasn't just Michael Jordan. You had other great players and great personalities. Right? In the 90s, you had the Shaquille O'Neals, the Charles Barkleys, the Dennis Rodmans. You had the Penny Hardaways. You had a bunch of different kinds of players. Like I said, you had talent. The Hakeem Olajuwons, the Karl Malones, the John Stocktons, right? The Patrick Ewings, the David Robinsons. You had great talent in the 90s, but you also had great personalities. And like I said, the game was overall pleasing to watch because it had balance. Right? Everyone wasn't just chucking up threes. You had three-point specialists. You had high flyers. You had great coaches that ran actual systems. Teams would half-court trap you, full-court press you. These are things that they would do. You had guys who took pride in defense, right? You had enforcers. You had legit big men. You had great pure point guards. The game was just balanced. You had great sixth man. All this stuff, man. So I wanted to do a breakdown of the 90s and the 2000s, but I want to do in different areas. So in this video, we're going to talk about the top perimeter defensive players of the 90s and the top perimeter defensive players of the 2000s. Now, I did this off the top of my head, guys. I did not do any hardcore research, so forgive me if I sound stupid here or I forget somebody that you thought should have been mentioned on these lists. Once again, I just, off the top of my head, the guys that I remember from the 90s. The 90s. I try to focus on the 90s guys, not the 80s guys. The 90s guys and the 2000s guys. And the perimeter defenders, not the big men, the perimeter defensive players of both eras. And like I said, I want to put some respect on some of these guys who don't get mentioned. Some of these guys we know. You know the main guys. But some of these guys you may not know. You may have forgotten about these guys. And I feel like I'm going to do that. I'm going to do a 90s, 2000s breakdown. Once again, not a comparison or to tear down or to make a case for one era over the other. But once again, just to put some lists together and highlight some of the better players on these lists. So, for example, maybe the next video I'll do the top 10 or the top, in-game dunkers of the 90s and the top in-game dunkers of the 2000s. And we make that comparison and we just talk about some of these guys. So let's start off with, like I said, the perimeter defensive players. Now, like I said, a lot of these guys you know. So with the 90s, we know who the top perimeter defenders, guys, like the main guys are, right? Michael Jordan, obviously, to me, is probably the greatest perimeter defender in NBA's history, man. When you talk about all the things that he could do on the basketball court, on the defensive end, along with his athleticism, his instincts, like I said, and his skills, you can make an argument Michael Jordan's the greatest perimeter defender of all time. Another guy you can make an argument for, Scottie Pippen. Once again, we know Michael Jordan's right-hand man. Scottie Pippen's one of the elite defensive perimeter players of all time. Maybe a little bit more versatile than Michael Jordan, but that does not make him a greater defender than Michael Jordan. So we obviously know about Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, two of the elite wing defensive players in the history of the game. If we think about some of the guys in the 2000s, some of the top guys in the 2000s, obviously we have Kobe Bryant, one of the elite defensive perimeter players of his era of all time. Kobe Bryant, one of the great two-way players in the history of the game, probably a top 5 two-way player in the history of the game. When you talk about guys like Michael Jordan, the Wilt Chamberlains, Jerry West, right? Some of these guys, Hakeem Olajuwon, some of these great two-way players. Kobe Bryant's right up there with the best of them. So we all know Kobe Bryant, like I said, the intangibles he brought in the defense and the effort, the hustle that he gave on defense, man. I've told you guys many times, half of defense is your effort, your want to play defense. And Kobe Bryant had that, the want to, the effort. So we know Kobe Bryant. But another great perimeter defensive player of the 2000s was Bruce Bowen. Bruce Bowen, another great perimeter defensive player, didn't really come into his own until the 2000s. A lot of people don't realize Bruce Bowen played in the mid to late 90s, if I remember correctly. I believe he was drafted in 96 or something like that, or 95, 90, somewhere around there. But he couldn't make a roster in the mid to late 90s in the NBA, just couldn't make a roster. And it took him years. I believe he went overseas and had to develop. And then he came back into the NBA in the 2000s and became one of the elite perimeter defensive players of the 2000s. I believe he made about 8 all defensive teams, if I remember correctly, and was runner-up to the Defensive Player of the Year award, I think 3 years in a row, if I'm not mistaken, from 04 to 07 or 05 to 07. I believe he was running for Defensive Player of the Year award, never quite made or won a Defensive Player of the Year award. But Bruce Bowen, who was known for a tough physical defender, right, hands-on you kind of guy, right, being able to use that physicality, he was a position defender. Right, you guys remember Bruce Bowen, like I said, guarding Kobe Bryant during those battles with the Spurs and the Lakers, man. So shout out to Bruce Bowen. So now we go back to the 90s. I don't know if I should go back and forth. I should just run down. Let me just run down some of the guys from the 90s, guys, that I wrote down here. All right, and then we'll go to the 2000s, guys. Dennis Rodman, obviously, Dennis Rodman, one of the all-time great defensive players. I told you guys, to me, he's probably the most versatile defensive player in the history of the game. I've literally witnessed and watched Dennis Rodman with my own eyes guard Magic Johnson in the postseason, right, in the NBA Finals. I watched Dennis Rodman guard Larry Bird in the postseason. Guard Larry Bird. I've watched Dennis Rodman guard Michael Jordan in the postseason when it mattered most, consistently. I've watched Dennis Rodman guard guys like Karl Malone in the postseason, in the NBA Finals, when it mattered most. And I've watched Dennis Rodman guard someone like Shaquille O'Neal when it mattered most in the postseason consistently. So when you think about Dennis Rodman, his overall impact and his versatility, to me, really is second to none. The man literally guarded every position, from point guard, shooting guard, small forward, all the way to center. And not only did he guard those positions, he guarded the greatest players at those positions. He guarded Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Karl Malone, Shaquille O'Neal. At that time, you could argue they were the greatest players at their position. You could have argued Shaquille O'Neal back in the day. You could argue Karl Malone back in the day. When Karl Malone retired, man, in the 90s, Karl Malone was considered the greatest power forward in the history of the game. I told you Larry Bird's a great small forward. Michael Jordan's a great shooting guard, and we all know Magic's a great point guard. And Dennis Rodman guarded all these guys with success, with consistency. So Dennis Rodman, we all know about him in the 90s, one of the great defensive guys on the perimeter in the 90s. Remember, he was more of a perimeter defensive player. In the 90s, or in the early 90s. And then, like I said, he evolved into the late 90s on the second 3P Bulls as being more of a stout defensive player down low in the post. So shout out to Dennis Rodman. Joe Dumars, another stout defensive player, playing on those bad boys Pistons. Another guy that guarded Michael Jordan heavily. It was literally Joe Dumars and Michael Jordan. Joe Dumars and Dennis Rodman guarding Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan going against some of the greatest defensive players in the history of the game and of the 90s. Joe Dumars, probably one of the most underrated defensive shooting guards or perimeter defenders in the history of the game. I believe he's a 6-time all defensive team member. And once again, it wasn't Joe Dumars necessarily getting a lot of blocks or steals at his position. It was the position basketball of Joe Dumars, the effort that he gave on the defensive end. And oftentimes, Joe Dumars was known for making great defensive plays in big moments. So he was a clutch defender, if that makes sense to you guys. So shout out to Joe Dumars, who Michael Jordan said was his toughest guy to go against. Joe Dumars, man. Shout out to Joe Dumars, in 1989 Finals MVP. Obviously, Gary Payton, probably or arguably the greatest defensive point guard in the history of the game, man. You could argue him with guys like Dennis Johnson or Walt Clyde Frazier, Jason Kidd, right? These are some of the great defensive point guards in the history of the game, man. And Gary Payton, like I said, you can argue is greater than all of them, man. His bulldog, pit bull mentality. The guy was, like I said, was known for being a trash talker, for being a true competitor, man. Not backing down, right? Always getting up for the challenge, man. He would go at Michael Jordan in the 96 finals, right? Giving that effort, the hustle, man. Like I said, he was a stout defensive player, man. Pound for pound, this dude was tough, man. So we think about Gary Payton and his exploits on the defensive end, the 1996 Defensive Player of the Year award winner. Like I said, in an era where some of the greatest defensive players in the history of the game, Gary Payton was able to win a Defensive Player of the Year award, man. So shout out to Gary Payton. Now, some of these other guys, like those are the top 5 guys that I wrote down that I figured were the top perimeter defenders of the 90s, man. And some of these other guys you may not remember. And I wanted to put some of these guys out there and put some respect on these guys. Derek McKey. Shout out to Derek McKey. I believe he was made a couple of all defensive teams in the 90s. Once again, let's remember here, guys. It's not necessarily about some of these guys making a bunch of all defensive teams or winning Defensive Player of the Year awards, which is why I put them on this list. It's what they were recognized for being in the 90s. Were they recognized as being defensive players? Remember also, it's not about these guys making 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 defensive teams, because if we remember, once again, it's the 90s we're talking about here. And all these guys are competing against each other. Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, Joe Dumars, Gary Payton. All these guys are competing with each other for defensive teams, right? When you think about some of these guards and these forward positions, man. So someone like Derek McKey is not going to make a whole bunch of all defensive teams in that era, because you're going against some of the greatest defensive players of all time, man, and at your position. But Derek McKey was a very rangy, long arms. I believe he was like 6'7", 6'8", small forward. And Derek McKey was often a guy that would guard Michael Jordan, right, on those Indiana Pacers teams, man. Derek McKey was often the guy matching up against Michael Jordan. He was a lot longer and bigger than Michael Jordan. They used that size to try to bother Michael Jordan, man. And he was a very solid defensive player. So once again, shout out to Derek McKey, one of the solid perimeter defenders of the 90s that doesn't get mentioned much. Nate McMillan, another guy who doesn't get mentioned much. I want to shout out to Nate McMillan, his defensive intensity, his prowess, the quick hands, quick feet of Nate McMillan, who was known once again as a position defender, being able to stay in front of his defensive man, a great stance on defense. Nate McMillan, who was part of that 1996 Seattle Supersonics team that went to the NBA Finals. And Nate McMillan was dealing with some injuries during those finals, so he wasn't at his best. I believe he only played in maybe 3 of the games, or 3 of the 6 games, if I remember correctly. He was dealing with maybe a neck injury or something like that. I can't remember. He got hurt like in the playoffs the round before or something like that. But Nate McMillan was one of the solid defensive players, so you had him out there with Gary Payton in the backcourt, right? A very solid defensive backcourt. You had guys like Hersey Hawkins, who was a solid defensive player. Shawn Kemp was a decent defensive player at his best, because he was a pretty good shot blocker at that power forward position. But the Seattle Supersonics were a formidable defensive team for years because of someone like a Nate McMillan. I believe Nate McMillan is a 3-time all-defensive player, once again, in the 90s. So shout out to Nate McMillan. Dan Marley, one of the slow, unathletic white guys that Michael Jordan was battling against. Shout out to Dan Marley, man. I believe Dan Marley's a 3-time all-defensive team member. And once again, Dan Marley gave the effort on the defensive end. Thunder Dan, one of the great 3-and-D guys of the 90s, one of the early 3-and-D guys in NBA's history, man. Dan Marley, a guy that could knock down the outside shot. he could also put it on the ground, on the floor, and dunk it on you, which is why he was nicknamed Thunder Dan. This dude was a solid athlete, about 6'6", about 215 pounds. He was solidly built, Dan Majerle, and he used his physicality on defense. This is why he gave guys like Michael Jordan a hard time. This is why he was known for his defensive prowess, and Michael Jordan took it personal in the 93 finals because he heard Dan Majerle was getting a lot of credit from someone like a Jerry Krause for his defensive abilities, right? So Michael Jordan made a point to prove that he can't touch him and that he's not on his level. And once again, we all know that great offense will beat great defense. And Dan Majerle was a solid defensive player who, once again, like I said, used his physicality and his strength on the defensive end and played that great position defense. He gave the effort on the defensive end. So shout out to Dan Majerle, one of the solid perimeter defensive players of the 90s, man. I mean, everywhere he went, teams were pretty much successful. He played, like I said, for the Miami Heat. Also, not just the Phoenix Suns in the 93 finals, but he also played for the Miami Heat. And once again, like I said, he was a formidable defensive player wherever he went. And like I said, he helped teams win wherever he went. So shout out to Dan Majerle. Like I said, the guy could knock down the shots, man. One of the early 3-and-D guys, man. The dude, I believe, had the record for three-pointers in a season, if I'm not mistaken. How about John Starks? I had to throw John Starks in this conversation. Once again, from the mid to late 90s or those early 90s, from like, 93 to about 1998, John Starks was one of the elite perimeter defenders, guys, who gave the effort on the defensive end. The New York Knicks were always a formidable defense from early to late 90s, and John Starks was a mainstay on those New York Knicks teams, man. We talk about guys like Patrick Ewing, the Charles Oakleys, the John Starks of the world, man. Right? It was John Starks who took over the role of Gerald Wilkins. When Gerald Wilkins, I believe he was traded from the Knicks to the Cleveland Cavaliers in the 1992-93 season, right? Remember, they brought him in to be the Jordan stopper for the Cleveland Cavaliers. It was John Starks who filled the role of Gerald Wilkins during the 1993 playoffs. You remember, the Knicks were up 2-0 on the Chicago Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals, and it was John Starks playing great defense on Michael Jordan. Remember, these guys studied film on Michael Jordan. They gave the effort. It mattered to them. So shout out to John Starks, man. Like I said, giving that effort on the perimeter during the 90s, man. Mookie Blaylock, another guy that I wanted to throw out there. Mookie Blaylock gave the effort on the defensive end, known for his stealing ability. Guy could create steals like no other. They had those quick hands. Shout out to Mookie Blaylock. I believe he made about 6 all-defensive teams during the 90s. Like I said, one of the top perimeter point guards, one of the top defensive point guards during the 90s, man, that people never mentioned. Mookie Blaylock. You guys probably, who the hell's Mookie Blaylock? I'm telling you right now, like I said, he was a solid point guard for the Atlanta Hawks from those mid to late 90s, played with guys like the Dikembe Mutombo, the Steve Smiths. I'm not sure if Kevin Wills was still on that team when Mookie Blaylock was there, but Mookie Blaylock was on that. I want to say it was the 97 Hawks that played the Bulls in the playoffs. I want to say it was 97. Maybe it was 96. I can't remember. But shout out to Mookie Blaylock, man. Kendall Gill. I want to shout out Kendall Gill, another guy, about 6'5", 6'6", a shooting guard. Another contemporary of Michael Jordan. Another guy who gave the effort on the defensive end, Kendall Gill, man. Like I said, he was a great athlete, Kendall Gill. He was a slasher, a high flyer, and a guy who gave the effort on the defensive end, who was known for creating steals at a high level. If I'm not mistaken, I think Kendall Gill still has the NBA record for most steals in a game. I believe he had 10 steals in a game, if I remember correctly, man. Shout out Kendall Gill, played a lot of years for the New Jersey Nets, man. But like I said, was a solid defensive player everywhere he went. And Eddie Jones, man. I just wanted to throw Eddie Jones out there. Another guy who played in those mid to late 90s into early 2000s. But he was really a solid defensive player in the 90s. So shout out to Eddie Jones. Now, when we think about some of the guys I mentioned from the 2000s, I know this video's going a little bit long, guys. But I want to run down some of these guys in the 2000s, man. I mean, as you guys can see, these guys in the 90s, man, some of these guys I read off, these guys are really great defensive players, man. Especially when you talk about the top guys. So I talked about Kobe Bryant, Bruce Bowen. Let's go about Shane Battier. Shane Battier, another really solid perimeter defensive player of the 2000s, man. Everywhere he went, like I said, he was an asset to the team. Like I said, he was a great glue guy and one of the elite perimeter defenders and one of the elite 3-and-D guys of the 2000s. Shane Battier, I believe, played for the Houston Rockets, played for the Memphis Grizzlies, I believe, played for the Miami Heat. Shane Battier. So shout out to Shane Battier. Like I said, man, he was just one of those really solid defensive players And like I said, he was known for being a 3-and-D guy, man. Gave that effort, was known as a position defender. You remember Shane Battier always having hands in players' faces like this, man, going against guys like Kobe Bryant, the Tracy McGrady's, the Vince Carters, the Ray Allens of the world, the Paul Pierces. So shout out to Shane Battier, man, one of the solid perimeter defenders of that era. Doug Christie, another guy, Doug Christie. I believe he started out on the Toronto Raptors in the late 90s, but really made his name in the 2000s on the Sacramento Kings as one of the elite perimeter defenders, going against Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers in those early 2000s. We all know the battles between the Sacramento Kings and the Lakers. There was a rivalry there for about 3 or 4 seasons in the early 2000s. And Doug Christie was the main perimeter defender on a Kobe Bryant. So shout out to Doug Christie. Like I said, man, a great position defender. A lot of these guys, they play great position defense. Bruce Bowen, Shane Battier, Doug Christie. No, they're not going to get a lot of steals or blocks, lead the league in blocks or steals or these kinds of things. But they play great position defense, great help defense, great team defense, these guys, man. And they were known for, like I said, being physical on the defensive end, right? Active hands, active feet. So shout out to Doug Christie. Ron Artest, another elite defender of the 2000s, man. Ron Artest won a Defensive Player of the Year award, I believe, in 2003, I want to say. I could be off on that. But he won a Defensive Player of the Year award on the Indiana Pacers. That was really where he made his claim to fame on the defensive end, playing on those Indiana Pacers teams that probably would have won a championship or went to an NBA Finals if it wasn't for that Malice at the Palace. A lot of people forget that season. I believe the Pacers were the best team that year. And remember, all the guys got suspended. The Steven Jacksons, the Jermaine O'Neals, Ron Artest. Like, these guys all got suspended. The team fell apart. I believe Reggie Miller was still on that team as an elder statesman at like 38 years old or something like that. But Ron Artest, man, one of the elite defenders, and once again, using his size and strength to his advantage, using the positions, the physicality on the defensive end, Ron Artest. And once again, Ron Artest intimidating players on the defensive end because he was very unpredictable, similar to a Dennis Rodman. Very unpredictable. It's that Ron Artest would be, known for elbowing guys. We all remember what he did to James Harden when he cleaned James Harden's clock with that elbow across the head. But Ron Artest, man, when he said one of the elite defensive players, or Metta World Peace, forgive me if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, or I don't want to disrespect the guy's name. Metta World Peace / Ron Artest, one of the elite perimeter defenders of the 90s. So shout out to him. How about you guys remember some of these other guys? Andre Kirilenko. Andre Kirilenko, man, he was a small forward / power forward of the 2000s. Really made his name on the Utah Jazz, right in those early 2000s Utah Jazz teams. So shout out to Andre Kirilenko, man. I mean, you can make an argument that Andre Kirilenko is one of the greatest shot-blocking small forwards of all time. You might be able to make that claim that he's the greatest shot-blocking small forward of all time, right? I mean, I think he was about 6'8", 6'9", Andre Kirilenko. I want to say he was from Russia. I want to say he was from Russia. Forgive me if I'm wrong about that, but I want to say he was from Russia. His nickname was AK-47. I mean, one of the coolest nicknames in all of NBA, AK-47. But this dude was a shot blocker extraordinaire. He could steal the basketball. I believe he has career averages of over a steal and over a block a game. At 6'8", 6'9", small forward, man. He had those long arms, very rangy Andre Kirilenko, and he gave the effort on the defensive end. One of the solid defensive players. So shout out to Andre Kirilenko, man. Never gets mentioned much. People forget about this guy. I believe he led the NBA in shot blocks one season at small forward, but I believe he only played like 48 or 49 games that season due to injuries. He had a lot of injury problems throughout his career, Andre Kirilenko. That's his biggest problem, was the inconsistent health of Andre Kirilenko. He was always in and out of the lineup, but he was a really great defensive player, man, at that position. Like I said, he gave them effort, really great shot blocker. Shout out to Andre Kirilenko. Jason Kidd, obviously one of the elite point guards or defensive point guards in NBA's history. One of the great point guards all around in NBA's history, man. Jason Kidd, I didn't put him down in the 90s player because to me he was more of a 2000s. I think in the 2000s he was just greater. That was when he was at his peak to me, was the 2000s. So I put him down, Jason Kidd, as one of the elite perimeter defensive players of the 2000s. Like I said, if you want to say Gary Payton was the greatest defensive point guard of the 90s, which he definitely was, then you can argue that Jason Kidd was the greatest defensive point guard of the 2000s. Like I said, when you talk about his rebounding ability along with his defense, his engine, his motor. Like I said, man, one of the elite defenders of his era at that position of all time. Jason Kidd. Like I said, the dude had the motor. Dude playing 43, 45 minutes a game. You guys remember Jason Kidd made his claim to fame playing on the Phoenix Suns, the New Jersey Nets, And obviously he won a championship with the Dallas Mavericks. But everywhere that Jason Kidd went, right, he was a leader there, man. He contributed to the team, man. He impacted winning. Jason Kidd could impact winning without impacting a box score. Without doing that, the man could score no points and impact winning like no other, man. This is Jason Kidd's game and one of the elite defenders of the 2000s. So shout out to Jason Kidd, man. Raja Bell, another solid defender. Like I said, like a Kendall Gill, like a John Starks, like an Eddie Jones. Raja Bell, I believe about 6'3", 6'4", shooting guard. You guys remember him and Kobe Bryant having beef. He played for the Phoenix Suns, which is where he made his name on the Phoenix Suns, on those Steve Nash, Amar'e Stoudemire Phoenix Suns of the early 2000s. So Raja Bell was like their main perimeter defender against someone like a Kobe Bryant and against the other team's perimeter threats. Shout out to Raja Bell, another guy who played good position defense. Raja Bell. Tayshaun Prince, man. Shout out to Tayshaun Prince, man. One of the most underrated defenders of the 2000s. I believe he was a 4-time all-defensive team member, if I remember correctly. We all know Tayshaun Prince made his name on the Detroit Pistons, on that great Detroit Pistons defense of the 2000s. You guys know the Detroit Pistons with the all-time great defenders like a Ben Wallace, but you also had a Tayshaun Prince there. You had along to go with someone like a Chauncey Billups, who was a solid defensive player, Rasheed Wallace, who was known for being a solid defensive player. So the Detroit Pistons were a very great and formidable defense. And Tayshaun Prince was a big reason for that. You guys remember Tayshaun Prince's block on Reggie Miller in the playoffs that year? When Reggie Miller thought he had a wide open layup and he took his sweet time to put this layup up. And Tayshaun Prince, with the range, the hustle, given the effort, was able to block Reggie Miller's layup right off the backboard, man. Go back and watch that replay. Tayshaun, just Google it. Tayshaun Prince block on Reggie Miller. I mean, the dude came from like half court and Reggie Miller was going for a layup and he got from half court to the backboard in like a split second and threw the ball off the backboard, man, and blocked Reggie Miller, which is one of the great defensive players of all time, guys, in my opinion, just off the effort and, like I said, the timing of it and the impact that he had on the game. So shout out to Tayshaun Prince. Like I said, a guy who would give Kobe Bryant fits in the 2004 NBA Finals. Like I said, just one of the great one of the great defensive players of the 2000s, man. Had those long arms, very rangy, very lanky, Tayshaun Prince. So shout out to him. And another guy I wanted to mention real quick, like I said, I know this video went really long, guys, forgive me. But I wanted to throw on Kirk Hinrich. Kirk Hinrich, I know you guys probably laughing at me. Kirk Hinrich. Remember, I did this on the top of my head, so forgive me if I forgot to mention some players. But I wanted to throw Kirk Hinrich out there. You know, I always respected Kirk Hinrich, man, as like a 3-and-D point guard type guy for those Chicago Bulls teams in the mid-2000s into the late 2000s. When you had guys like, I think, like Ben Gordon on that team, the Luol Dengs, I believe, was on that team at the time. But you had Kirk Hinrich on that team. I think Joakim Noah might have even been on those Chicago Bulls teams of the mid to late 2000s. But Kirk Hinrich, like I said, gave the effort, could knock down the open shot, and like I said, was a pest on defense, giving the effort. Kirk Hinrich, I don't know if he made an all-defensive team. He might have made maybe one all-defensive team in his career, if I remember correctly. But like I said, he gave the effort on the defensive end, Kirk Hinrich and stuff. Like I said, guys, he was a great position guy. One of those great glue guys, like I said, would make your team better on the defensive end. He impacted the defensive end. So, like I said, man, shout out to Somos Banditos. I hope I did you guys some justice here. The people of the 90s and the 2000s, the great or the solid perimeter defenders, the top guys I could think of off the top of my head, guys. Let me know what you guys think, man. I mean, if you think about some of these names, if you think about some of the guys that are like the top guys from the 90s, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, Joe Dumars, Gary Payton, you think about some of these guys, you're talking about arguably the greatest defenders at those positions. Michael Jordan, the shooting guard. You can argue he's the greatest shooting guard, defensive shooting guard of all time. I don't even think it's an argument. Scottie Pippen, to me, Scottie Pippen is probably the greatest defensive small forward of all time. Yeah, you can argue Kawhi Leonard. You could argue that, but to me, I'm putting Scottie Pippen above Kawhi Leonard because Scottie Pippen was there more consistently than Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi Leonard was great on the defensive end for like a 3 or 4 year stretch there, from like 2014 to like 2017, man, right? But then he started having those injury problems, and then he wasn't really playing consistently. Scottie Pippen was out there for 80 games, man, 82 games every season, man, giving the effort on the defensive end. So I'm gonna go with Scottie Pippen, but you can argue Kawhi Leonard. So that's 2 positions right there. Dennis Rodman, you could argue, is a great defensive power forward in the issue of the game. You could argue that, right? I don't think it's a stretch. Dennis Rodman, to me, he's the most versatile defensive player of all time. We think about Gary Payton, who, like I said, you could argue and say he's the greatest defensive point guard in the history of the game. So when you think about these metrics, you're talking about the greatest point guard of all time in the 90s, Gary Payton. You're talking about the greatest shooting guard of all time in the 90s, Michael Jordan. The greatest defensive small forward of all time in the 90s, Scottie Pippen. The greatest defensive power forward of all time in the 90s, Dennis Rodman. Right? I mean, it's just crazy, man. And like I said, man, in the 90s, Dennis Rodman evolved, right? He went from a perimeter defender, mostly a perimeter defender, to a down low defensive player. And then we all know about the elite defenders, like the centers, like Hakeem Olajuwon. So you could really argue that the 90s had the greatest defenders at each position, guys. You can make that argument. It just shows you how great these guys were, how good the 90s were. And like I said, even the other guys, the Joe Dumars, the Derek McKees, the Nate McMillans, the Dan Marleys, like the John Starks, even someone like Joe Wilkins I didn't mention, a Kendall Gill, a Mookie Blaylock. I mean, my goodness. And then we think about the 2000s, Kobe Bryant, right? Bruce Bowen, Ron Artest, Jason Kidd, Tayshaun Prince, Doug Christie, Shane Battier, Andre Kirilenko, Rajah Bell, Kurt Heinrich. I mean, these are some really solid defensive players. Joe Wallace. I don't know if you guys remember Joe Wallace. To me, he was another solid defender, great athlete during those 2000s. Made his claim on I believe it was the Charlotte Bobcats, if I remember correctly, Joe Wallace. And then I think again on the Brooklyn Nets in the late 2000s or whatever it was. So shout out to Joe Wallace too, man. But you guys can see, man, these were just some great defenders, man. Guys who gave the effort, great position defenders, guys that could block shots, get steals. I mean, just really great names out here, man. So shout out to all those guys. Shout out to my man, Somos Banditos. Shout out to the 2000s. Shout out to the 90s, man. Like, you guys know the deal, man. We must continue to put some respect on these guys, man. You guys know the deal, man. I'll catch you guys on the next one.